I need your help this morning. Can you make this sound? Can you do that? Can you do it 3 times and then stop? Let's try it. 1, 2, 3. It's harder than it sounds, isn't it? Yes, to do that. 3 times. Let's try it one more time. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, there's going to be 3, 4 times during the sermon when I do this, then you do. Let's try it with just my fingers. You ready? Got to wait for the fingers to go. When that 3rd finger goes, then you can start. Okay, ready? One more time. All right. Ready? Are you sure? Went the blinker on my dad's 1993 Ford conversion van. Now, those of you that are too young to remember conversion vans, let me give you a quick installment on the virtues of 1980s style. Back in those days, we would take a van, in this case a Ford van, that was empty, and we would fill it with leather seats and lush carpeting and wet bars and fancy lighting and electronics, and it was called a conversion van because you had converted it from plain Jane to something far more dashing and engaging. Every Adventist school, it seemed like, that went on a field trip, every Pathfinder club that went somewhere, if you could get a hold of a conversion van or 3, you were sitting pretty. Well, that's what I was driving, my dad's 1993 Ford conversion van, with some of our students from my youth group. I was a youth pastor in 1995. That was the last millennium, for those of you that can recall that. Some of our youth group had decided we were going to go on a mission trip over Christmas. And when that blinker was blinking, it was Christmas Eve day. We had just pulled on to Highway 16 there in Tacoma, Washington. I was a youth pastor at Tacoma Central Seventh-day Adventist Church. It was my first full year of, quote, professional pastoral ministry. And as the youth leader, we had together talked about and finally decided we would give up our holiday for the sake of going on the ultimate workout. That's what it was called, the ultimate workout. Some of you may remember Fred Cornforth, working with Insight Magazine, I believe, organized these various domestic, as in within the United States, mission trips. And this one was going to be over Christmas and New Year's. Big sacrifice for our kids. And our kids, I admired them for doing it. They would not be home around the tree opening gifts or grandma's house or any of that. They would instead be serving the Lord through serving other people. And you would think that that would cause me to be filled with righteous joy as I pulled onto the highway there with my van full of kids, headed for San Francisco, 17 hours away, where the mission trip was to take place. But if you thought that, you would be wrong. Because you see, this was to be my first Christmas as a married man. And in my mind, as I'm pulling onto the highway there, 17 hours, there, and then 17 hours back, and I love youth. I love working with kids. This just somehow didn't seem right? And I'm thinking, okay, now what were you supposed to do if you're a new bride and groom and it's your first Christmas together? Well, you go down to the Hallmark store and you buy an ornament that says Shane and Darlene on it with the year, 1995. And you can always look back at that ornament and say, well, that's the one that we got on our first Christmas together. Or since we lived in Washington State, we were supposed to go to Leavenworth. That's not a prison. That's actually a town. It's kind of this German-esque European feel town there. It's gorgeous. And particularly there in the mountains of central Washington at Christmas time, there's usually a blanket of snow, and they do it up big light show, and there's good food to eat and all of this stuff. I thought, well, aren't we supposed to be doing that? At the very least, first Christmas as a married couple, we should be going to our respective relatives' houses and showing one another off. Look at the prize bride I've got here, arm candy and brains too. It would have been great, But none of that. is going to happen on this trip. In fact, if you had asked me, I think I probably would have said this would be a most unlikely Christmas for anything super great and good to happen. Went the hooves of a donkey on its way to not San Francisco, but to someplace far different, a little town in Palestine called Bethlehem. Mary and Joseph, married for a little less than a year, were experiencing their first season together, but if they had any expectations of how idyllic this time would be, they were certainly not being fulfilled. In fact, let's read about it. Luke chapter 2, verse 1. Luke chapter 2, verse 1. Right after, of course, Luke chapter 1, in which we find the story of the birth of John the Baptist. That occurred about 6 months before the birth of Christ. Speaking of which, let's read. Luke chapter 2, verse 1. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and the line of David. I think sometimes we miss the profound irritation and even rage that accompanied this part of the Christmas story. The reason why Caesar was wanting to have a census was not merely so he could count the Romans, but particularly so that he could count the Jews. In fact, it was a little bit like a farmer out counting cows or something. The Jews, of course, lived in Palestine, an occupied territory. The Romans held sway over seemingly every significant portion of Jewish life. And to have Caesar say, oh, by the way, we need you to make a long, dangerous trip to your town so that we can see how many of you there are. Perhaps so that he would know how many soldiers to send to be in the garrison there to keep the Jews under control. They were prone to rioting in those days. The census was not a compliment. It was a slap in the face. Add to that the original language implies pretty strongly, and thus this is why many English translations will say it, there was a tax associated with this sentence. In other words, not only were you being counted by a foreign oppressor, you were being asked to pay for the privilege. And so I imagine that on every road in Palestine that was any sort of main thoroughfare at all, as they were traveling down there in groups, I mean, men were just fuming about this. Women were telling stories about how terrible this was. Joseph and Mary, the only benefit to the great crowds was probably that they were less likely to be robbed along the way because of all the people that were traveling together. Travel was generally dangerous even without thieves in those days. Very mountainous territory between Bethlehem and Nazareth. I've been to both places. If you go there today, don't make a beeline trip. At least that's what the State Department will tell you, between Nazareth and Bethlehem. Nazareth in the north, if you go straight down, you go through Palestinian territory, through some of the most dangerous portions, historically speaking, of Palestinian territory. And regardless of what you think of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one thing is for certain. When you fly into Israel, generally, you will get a rental car that has Israeli plates. And if you take those Israeli plates and you do not have a Palestinian guide with you in the car and you go into Palestinian territory, many times, in fact, most of the time these days, the State Department says, don't do that. We can't guarantee that we can get you out. Well, back in Joseph and Mary's day, whether there was an armed assailant after you or not was somewhat irrelevant because the terrain itself, it's incredibly hilly over there, very rough, rock strewn everywhere. If you've ever been over there, I mean, it's just rugged territory. And if you are, well, let's read about it. Verse 5. Joseph went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. Now you notice I said they had already been married. In Jewish culture in those days, if you were engaged, it was considered to be the same level of commitment as if you were married. People treated you that way. Mary would never have traveled in those days pregnant without having this very firm life commitment from Joseph. It would have been too scandalous. It would have been too dangerous, to be honest. And so they are, in essence, considered to be married folk, and she is pregnant. Now, we moved here back in 2004 with a baby on board. Ellie was inside, not yet born. And it was an uncomfortable process. Okay, and this is in the 21st century, right? We've got all these modern conveniences, etc. I cannot imagine being, almost at your due date on a donkey at best over this hilly terrain for several days on end, because that's what it would have taken to get from Nazareth down to Bethlehem. You add to it all of the national implications, the insult of the Romans taxing them and counting them like cattle on someone's farm. And my guess is it was a very, very difficult trip. You add to that even once they've come and registered, there's no hotel, there's no place available, no place to stay. Contractions are coming faster and faster, closer together. Verse 6. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. I obviously was not there that night, neither were you. But I think it is safe to say that what happened that evening after the birth of Jesus was very similar to what happens with almost every mother today. After hours of pushing and labor and difficulties and stress and strain, when that baby is finally born and you see that it is healthy and vibrant and glowing, all of the difficulties and the irritation and all of that fades, at least for a moment, in the sheer joy of a new life coming into the world. And for Mary and Joseph, this was probably more joyful than even the average baby. This was the promised one. This is the one conceived of God. This was the Messiah. And at least for that little pocket of time, I imagine that there were broad smiles on Mary and Joseph's faces as they realized at last Messiah had come. You might even say that trip to Bethlehem was a profitable one. But then again, even the most profitable trips can turn from delightful to difficult and even to dangerous. Went the blinker of my dad's 1993 Ford conversion van as we exited unexpectedly, unplannedly, off onto an on-ramp off of the interstate in Oakland, California. Now, for those of you that know your geography, Oakland is just across the bay from San Francisco. And at least in those days, Oakland was not a great place to go. It was the place that you passed through on your way to someplace else, right? Like San Francisco, for instance. And the reason we pulled off in an unplanned fashion is because the fuel pump on my dad's van was clearly on its last legs. Before I left, Dad said, every now and then that pump is not sounding right, so I put a spare in back of one of the seats there in the van. You'll probably be fine. We were not fine. In fact, it was surging. It's heavy traffic there. It's not a time when you really want things to be giving out, right? And so I'm thinking, I'm listening to this thing. Okay, it's time to get off. Let's just change it, and hopefully we can move on smoothly with the rest of our trip. We take the first available exit. It's in a not-so-nice part of town, and we pull off into a gas station / convenience store there off to the side, and I'm kind of looking around the neighborhood here. Gang activity was sky high in those days in Oakland. It was not a very safe place to be, much less with a youth group, right? But we really didn't have a choice since our one and only little Chariot here was not running very well. So I pull out the new pump, I slide under the van, and let me just tell you a little secret. I'd worked on a lot of cars up to this point, and all of them had been carbureted. Never touched fuel injection in my life. And it doesn't matter, if you're not mechanically inclined, you'll understand why that's important here in just a moment. I called my dad, and I think we had a brick phone. Remember those brick phones? They could be used as weapons in a pinch. They're very large cell phones. And he explained what to do, and so I slid under the van there, and sure enough, there's the pump. And it's quite corroded. I mean, there's mud all over it and stuff, and I thought, oh man, it's going to be a pain to get off. And there's two clips. There's two lines that come into it. And I pulled off the clip on the pressure side. And I get a good grip on it there, and I start to pull. And, I mean, it's like butter. This thing is just coming off in my hand, right? What I didn't know is that there's a substantial amount of residual pressure in many fuel injection systems. And I was getting some assistance, unbeknownst to me, in getting that line off. And I'm pulling it off there, and this is about 6 inches above my head. And as it just clears the end, and all unleaded breaks loose. And it's like this kind of like a rocket, little ship there. The line was a flexible line that I had taken off, and so it bent right towards my face. And this high pressure stream of unleaded is headed for my face. This is why this is one of the few reasons that you should want to wear glasses, right? Because you never know when a fuel pump line is going to come off and spray you in the face, right? So I'm there, and this all takes a while to tell, but it happened very, very quickly. It sprays across. I close my eyes. It sprays across my glasses and straight into my ear. And I had never had gas in my ear before, and it really, really, really hurts. I mean, this is like powerful. This is like lacquer thinner type stuff in your ear. Your inner ear, I mean, that is sensitive skin. And suddenly it was just, packed with this stuff. And, oh, did it burn. I'd never felt anything like it. I roll out from under the van and I crawl out, water, water, someone give me some water. And my youth group, levitates off the seats inside the van, and they're scrambling around. Somebody finds a water bottle and throws it out the window, and I dump it in my ear, and it's not making it in there. Somebody who was getting gas at the gas pump actually ran inside, bought some bottled water, and brought it out to me. And so I'm trying to do this irrigation thing, and it's just not working. I have no idea why. And it's just getting worse. It's excruciating. And finally, somebody said, there's a hospital not far from here. We'll take you to the ER. Well, I jumped at the chance. And I got in the front seat here. I'm covered with gas. And I get in the front seat, and we roar off down the road towards the hospital, leaving my highly trained martial arts expert wife in the middle of Oakland in a strange neighborhood with a van that doesn't work and 6 youth. Okay. She later said that was one of the more ominous moments of her life up to that point. Meanwhile, I'm in the van and apparently making enough noise that the driver is very urgent. And so we're flying 60, 70 miles an hour through this neighborhood on the way to the hospital. And finally, we pull up to the ER. I jump out of the van. I think I said thank you on the way out. I go in, the doors slide open of the ER, and I tell the first person I can see, I said, I'm covered in gas and there's fuel in my ear. And the ER doc steps out from behind the nurse's station, and he steps forward and he says, nobody light a match. Good counsel. I knew I was in good hands from there on out. And so I guess they didn't get cases like me all the time. And I later learned that they were a little concerned about my mental well-being because, if you think about it, the only reason people get doused with gasoline is if someone's trying to kill them or they're trying to kill themselves, right? And so, do we treat from the neck down or do we treat from the neck up first? What's the protocol here? They finally decided they were going to irrigate my ear as best they could with water, but they didn't have any facilities to do that. And so they cleared out no joke, a janitor's closet. This was not sanitary at all. So if you're worried about that, the statute of limitations has run out, so don't worry about it. But they clear out this closet, and I'm there, and they say, well, you should take your clothes off because, they were saturated. I'm like, oh man, have you worn hospital clothes? Have you done that? Yeah, don't do it in public. It's not, you'll be arrested. It's not good. They're not modest things. And so that's all they had. So I'm like double wrapping here. And get this, and they said, go wait in one of the OR rooms across the hall, and we'll be in, and we'll take a look at your ear. I won't describe what was there. It was truly, it looked like a war zone. Oakland, again, was not a real happy spot in those days. And there were things that used to belong to a person that were still lying around in that room. It was an absolute sty. And I sat there in my little corner, which I hoped was sanitary, and they came in, they put saline solution, all of this, and finally said, okay, we think you'll be all right. Gave me a little more layering, and by this time, Darlene and the youth group had walked those 7 or 8 blocks to the hospital, and they met me there. We took a cab back. I finished the repair. The fuel pressure was now relieved, so it was safe to work on the car. I got the new pump in there, started up just fine, and we finally, hours later, drove away from that convenience store. And I remember thinking to myself, we are at last through with whatever danger is going to befall us on this trip. And I'll just tell you a secret. That was true. I didn't put any more gas in my ear. Nothing else of a physical, dangerous thing happened. We really were past the danger for that trip. Which is interesting because when you think about it, in light of the first Christmas story, that assumption was a luxury that Mary and Joseph never had. In fact, if we read about it, Matthew chapter 2, verse 13, here's what we read. The wise men have just been there, the magi with their gifts, etc. Verse 13 of Matthew 2, when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt have I called my son. Most of the time, I think, when we think of the Christmas story, we forget what a risk it was. Now, I realize some people struggle with the notion of God actually taking risk. How does someone that knows the future actually take a risk? And I understand that. I'm sympathetic to that. But one thing that I think is quite clear in Scripture, that whatever liabilities Jesus took on, one of them was the notion of genuine risk. Jesus, at several key points in his life, seemed to clearly understand that he may not make it through the next portion of his life. When Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he says, Father, please, if it be possible, take this cup from me. He's sweating drops of blood. This is not the reaction of someone who says, well, it's all just smoke and mirrors anyway. Everything's going to be all right in the end. And when Jesus is on the cross, and he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? At that moment, it is very clear. Jesus cannot see through the tomb to the other side. This is beyond risk for him. This is the end for him. As far as he could see, God in human flesh, as far as he knew, the risk was quite simply everlasting for him to come here and become one of us. And I think it's important, at this time of year, and to be honest, at any time of year, I think it's important that we remind ourselves, that we ask the question and answer it well. Why did Jesus do this? Why does Jesus come, take on humanity, and take all the risk that he did? Why did he come? Or perhaps we could put it this way. What did he come to do that was so important that it required all of that risk? Went the blinker of my dad's 1993 Ford conversion van as we turned finally into the Mountain View Academy parking lot there in the Greater Bay Area. Mountain View Academy was to be the headquarters for the ultimate workout for our mission trip. And as you might imagine, I was a bit tired, and we were all very late getting to this orientation evening meeting. In fact, as we arrived, they were literally just basically having closing prayer and finishing up. So we missed all of our assignments. I didn't know where we were going to go. The kids didn't know where they're going to go. One of the leaders came and met us. We explained, and smells like you had trouble. Yes, we did, actually. And explained all of that. And they told us where we were going briefly. We all went to bed. and got up the next day to do, well, our group went to 4 different places. One of those places was a place called the Jewish Child Care Center. It was, as the name implies, run by Jews. There's quite a Jewish population there in the Bay Area. And in many ways, this was just your basic daycare center. There were, we assumed, Jewish families that needed to have child care during the day, and so they would send their children here, and the staff would take care of them. And so I was there for a couple of days helping to supervise our students as they took care of the children. Now, I think, based on my short stay there, that many of the families that sent their children to that daycare center were genuinely in need. They may have been low income. They didn't have any other alternatives. Mom and dad were working, and so this was a great thing for them. I also think that based upon the less than stellar behavior of some of the students, that there were some parents who were doing just fine that didn't want to keep their hellions at home during the day. And so they sent them off for a small fee to be taken care of by, in our case, these volunteers. Some of those kids just drove me nuts. Okay. This was before I had children of my own and realized that they're all cherubs and angelic, etc. And so this tested my patience. I still smell like gasoline. I am bone tired, and we're just on the first day of our mission trip. Some of our kids also did beach trash pickup. San Francisco, of course, is right along the West Coast. And there's lots of beaches there, and certainly in those days, I don't know about now, but there was a pretty high homeless population. During the warmer months of the year, they would live on the beach. Some of them had some fairly dark habits. I'm not going to tell you all the things that we found there. Some of our students did find needles in the sand, which from drug use. I'm very glad that they found the needles before the needles found them in that type of very unclean environment. It was good that we were able to clear off a lot of the trash that had made its way onto those otherwise quite beautiful beaches. Some of our kids also went to Habitat for Humanity. If you've never been a part of Habitat for Humanity, I have not done a project with them for quite some time, but back in those days, one of my favorite charities. These are contractors that will donate their time, people will donate materials, and there in the San Francisco area, there was an entire new development that was being built entirely by Habitat for Humanity. And the idea is this: with these donated materials and labor, people that could not otherwise afford a house could be given one. Now, admittedly, these houses didn't have any frills. I mean, there was no extras on these. They were basically just boxes. Occasionally, some of them were big boxes with littler boxes inside for rooms. But they were nice, they were watertight, and they were certainly better than living on the streets. I remember one family that came through. They were allowed to give a preview, to get a preview, I should say, of the home that they would be moving into. And I mean, to this day, I can see the look on the mother's face when she came in through the doors. I'm guessing that most all of us live in fancier places than this, even if your house is not fancy, because again, this is just a basic house. But you would have thought she just walked through the pearly gates. I mean, she could not imagine in her wildest dreams that this place was going to be hers. And then there was Glide. GlYde. Glide. I have long since forgotten what those letters stand for, the acronym that it stands for. It was a soup kitchen, and it was wretched. At least on our side of things. I don't know what it was like on the serving line side of things. I suspect that it was clean and that things were nice and didn't smell. But if you were in the kitchen, if you were in the receiving area, at the loading dock, it stank to wherever it could stink to. It was terrible. Because you see, Glide, like so many soup kitchens, the way that they got their volume of food was by getting what had expired from local grocery stores. Now, some of that food was not just expired, it was aged to extinction, okay? It was gross. I mean, bread is bad enough. You know, if it's covered with moldy bread, you know, this kind of dusty thing comes off of it there. You can just toss that. Rotten broccoli? Do you ever smell rotten broccoli? If you have children, you'll know what rotten broccoli smells like. Small babies, I mean, it's bad. And unfortunately, Glide was not a vegetarian establishment. And so entire pallets of expired meat would be brought in, and they would pick through it, or in our case, they would have our volunteers pick through it to find meat that was still edible. it was just gross. And our kids came back from there, and they said, it's like a war zone back there. And of course, because they were the only a few days here volunteers, they were the ones that got, I would imagine the long-term volunteers were so pleased to see our students walk through the door. By all means, please, take my spot. Our students were there for a couple of days, and again, it was gross, it was, all of that. But did you know, a group of 73 young people, of which our youth group comprised some of them, 73 young people served 8,500 meals in one day. One day. You can begin to see why they were so desperate to get food, even to the point of having to throw away, 80% of a load just to get 20% that was good. Because the volume of people that didn't have a way to eat was sky high. And looking over the work done during that 5-6 day period, I could honestly say that in spite of the troubles, it was an honor to do what we had done. In spite of little sleep and raunchy smells in soup kitchens and difficult children in daycare centers and gas in my ear and missing my first Christmas with my new bride, it was still an honor to go and to serve all those people who so deeply needed it, because after all, that's why Jesus came. And Jesus himself proclaims it. Listen carefully as I read Jesus, his own words, Luke chapter 4, beginning with verse 18. Jesus said this, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me." To do what? To preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus took the risk of the incarnation. He took the risk of enduring dirty stables and murderous kings, doubting disciples, conspiring hypocrites, and ultimately the risk and the shame and the torture of the cross. He did all of that because he loves us and he wants to serve us, and ultimately he wants to set us free. Not merely from physical chains, but most importantly from our spiritual ones, that we might be truly free in every sense of the word. The babe in the manger was a chain breaker of eternal proportions. And no risk was too high for Jesus to take in order that we might be free. That's why Jesus took the unlikely risk of Christmas for you and for me. Went the blinker on my dad's 1993 Ford conversion van for the last time as we pulled off of Highway 16 back into Tacoma. We had made it home. 34 plus hours of driving, many hours given in service to others. We dropped off all of the kids at their various spots, and I realized afresh in the quietness now of that van that though it wasn't the ideal first Christmas in some ways for my bride and I, even though we had missed the Christmas tree ornament in Grandma's house and a trip to Leavenworth, it turned out to be a pretty good Christmas after all. And not just because of what we had done in San Francisco, but most of all because of what Jesus had done 2,000 years earlier for us. Which brings us to this Christmas, 2020. Talk about your unlikely Christmases. This Christmas, perhaps more than any in recent memory, seems an unlikely one for great things to happen. We're all wearing masks. There's a global pandemic going on that has affected nearly every aspect of our lives in one way or another, in a negative way. Political unrest continues, not just in this country, but in many countries around the world. The economy, who knows? Who knows what tomorrow will bring? And consequently, many times just basic day-to-day living can seem weighted down and difficult and dark at times. But my trip to San Francisco proved quite well, I think, that however unlikely it may seem, good things can come from situations that we would expect to only go badly under normal conditions. And on a far grander scale, Jesus proved in the most unlikely of circumstances 2,000 years ago and still today that no matter how unlikely it may seem, even in 2020, that God still serves and still saves all who are willing. My prayer for us this holiday season is that we will never forget the condescension of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And may this Christmas season be an unexpectedly good one in Him. Jesus, we praise you for becoming our newborn King. Lord, it may have been many years ago that you gave us that blessing, but it has only grown stronger and stronger, Lord, in its ability to save. I thank you, Jesus, that we can celebrate this season. I pray that indeed, in spite of whatever challenges we may face, that it can still be a season of light, of grace, of mercy, and of wholeness. Grant us this freedom, for I pray it in your name. Amen.